Hart.
Hello.
She is a professor of anthropology at McMaster University. She's located up north in Canada. And she's here today to talk to us about paleoethnobotany. So I'm going to turn it over to Shanti.
All right. Well, thank you, Kathy. Thank you, everyone, for having me, inviting me to give the guest lecture today. So hopefully you guys can see this. Hopefully the slides work okay. We'll see how this goes. Nope, that slide is not advancing. There we go. Okay. So who am I? Kathy gave me a brief introduction, but just to give you a little more context, I am an assistant professor, professor at McMaster University up here in Canada where we have no more snow. I'm an anthropologist in the broader field of anthropology and have a strong interest in ethnoecology and foodways. I'll talk a little bit about that further on. I'm also a Mesoamerican archaeologist like Professor Sorensen. I've worked in many parts of Mesoamerica, including the Maya, Lenca, Zapotec, and Mixtec areas. And I'm a paleoethnobotanist, specializing in macrobotanical and microbotanical analysis. And so you see an image of me here operating a microscope with a key aspect of equipment located there in a front, generously donated by Kathy Sorensen. Let's see, it takes us a moment to advance. There we go. Okay, so what is paleoethnobotany? Well, I say, waiting for the slide to advance. It literally means the study of old human plants. All those words are kind of thrown in there. And effectively, it's a study of ancient human-plant interactions. So it's not to be confused with ethnobotany, which would be if you're studying similar sorts of things, but in the modern era, modern human-plant interactions. And it's not quite the same as paleobotany, which means that you are studying ancient plants or ancient sort of ecological interactions, focusing on plants. And it's not even quite the same as archaeobotany, although that is the term that they prefer over the pond. So if you're in Europe, for example, you wouldn't describe yourself as a paleoethnobotanist, but an archaeobotanist, even though they're very similar things. They're effectively the same thing for our purposes. All right, so in paleontobotany, basically what we're doing, again, is mapping interactions between humans and plants, but in the past. So the past part is the critical part here. And this is just an image from a mural of in a museum in Honduras showing all the different ways that plants might have factored into daily lives in the past. And I've circled here just about every kind of plant item pictured. Plants, great importance in antiquity. So there are a lot of different kinds of anthropological questions that we could answer using paleoethnobotanical methods. And I've listed a few here. I'm not going to go over them in detail. You're welcome to review them later. But we can think about political uses of plants, plants used in trade, special foodstuffs that get moved around the world. If you're all familiar with Sidney Mintz's work on sweetness and power, just thinking about sugar, which comes from a grass for the most part, how that made its way across the world, how it was mobilized for political ends. These are all sort of critical things that we can think about that are, of course, related to plants. There are symbolic meanings, there are aspects of food, ritualized practice in different ways, lots and lots and lots of different things that we can think about when we talk about plants. So my interests specifically have to do with foodways, plants in general, daily life, and human environment relationships of different kinds. And I'll tell you a little bit about that research a little further down the road here. So what are foodways? I'm borrowing here from the definition given by Jay Anderson, who was actually in folklore, not an archaeologist, when he described it in 1971 as the whole interrelated system of food conceptualization, procurement, distribution, preservation, preparation, and consumption shared by all members of a particular group. And this is a pretty good working definition to go with. So when we're thinking about the past, there are a lot of things we can think about in terms of what characterizes foodways. We could talk about ethnobotanical activities of different kinds, cultivation, agriculture, consumption, how people shared food or didn't share food, different kinds of special uses, feasting contexts, and the historical context within which all of these things took place. So a lot of sort of rich narratives surrounding plants in different ways. So we can learn about ancient foodways, and specifically those ancient foodways that have to do with plants, in a couple of different ways. So if we don't make use of ethnographic analogy, that is, if we're not making use of understandings about the present to get at the past, and we look at just the data alone, there are a couple of different things that we can do. We can research the origins of ingredients. Where are the first places where these things come from? We can think about clusters of foodstuffs of different kinds. We can talk about biomedical properties. So are there psychoactive properties associated with plants, or medical or medicinal uses of plants, regardless of how people in the past actually use them? So there are a lot of things that we can think about, even if we don't make use of ethnographic analogy. But if we do start to make use of ethnographic, ethnohistoric, and analogies using these sort of Pompeii-like circumstances where things are perfectly preserved in place, where you've got, for example, a volcano that erupts and ash spews everywhere and it kind of preserves everything in a really nicely kind of sealed context, then we can use that as an analogy as well. So if we look at an ancient plant in the past, and we want to figure out, okay, how was this used? Why were people using it? What are some of the properties that it's got? We can sometimes look to the present. How are people using it now? Or read historic records of different kinds to try and understand how people historically might have used the plant. And then, of course, there are different kinds of relative measures. We might not have a good sense of the properties of a particular plant. We may not have good ethnographic analogies to work with. We may not even know what the plant is. But we could talk about variation, numbers of different kinds of plants that we find in different contexts, in different locations. So we could look at relative shifts of crops over time, maize versus root crops, for example. Or we could talk about relatively higher counts of plant remains in one place, like an ancient household, versus another place, like an ancient plaza. So there are different ways that we can approach plant activity in the past and understand ancient foodways in the past when we're looking at plants. So paleoethnobotany effectively, in one, from one sort of perspective, becomes an approach to past practices of different kinds. And I'll talk a little bit more about the coquillole pollen that I have pictured here in just a moment. So, advanced slide. Lots of different kinds of practices related to plants in ancient Mesoamerica. And I'm not going to list all of these off, but I will go into a little bit of detail for each one of these. So we can think about, just to sort of start off here, if the slide advances. Come on, slide. No, is it frozen? There we go. So production of different kinds. So this can have to do with organizing people to harvest some crops, the scheduling of crops at different times. When are you going to plant things? Gardening, different ways of gardening, different ways that you might fallow your fields, which might mean that by leaving certain plants in your fields, that'll attract bees and help you to produce honey. We can think about field ridging, burning, digging, all the sorts of things that people do to prepare their plants or to go out and collect plants in different ways. So this runs the whole sort of gamut from active cultivation and even domestication of certain plants, right down to seeing a weed in the sidewalk and picking it up and bringing it home because you think it might have some sort of use. I don't necessarily recommend that anybody does that. All right, so we've also got these different modes of procurement that might have to do with going out collecting resins from a tree. I've got here pictured, you probably won't be able to see my pointer, that's one kind of drawback here, but there's a gentleman picking off bits of resin from a tree trunk. That's the copal tree in the northern Yucatan, and the resin that's there, oh, hey, there's a cursor. Oh, I don't know that I can operate that cursor, but someone else knows how to operate it. That's great. So we've got a certain kind of resin used ceremonially to produce a sort of incense smoke in different kinds of ritual contexts. And so that's what this gentleman is collecting here from the trunk of the tree. A moment of procurement. All right, let's see if that's advancing. Then there's the processing. A lot of plants, you can't just sort of eat them right away. You can't use them right away for medicinal purposes, or they don't end up being ritual plants just by virtue of the fact that you go out and pick up some of this resin and bring it back and put it on an altar. So you have to prepare plants in different ways, and all the modes of processing, they can be fairly complex. The peeling, the cutting, the grinding, boiling, burning, roasting, molding, all sorts of ways that people prepare plants when they're going to use them. There's preservation. So if you're going to store plants, whether for food or in the case of this artist depiction right here, tobacco that's being cured and dried and stored for later. There are a lot of things that we can think about in terms of plant preservation. And then there's consumption. So how are people consuming these things? Are they smoking the tobacco? Are they preparing incense from the copal tree? Are they cutting into a papaya and just eating the fruit? Are they making use of the papaya seeds medicinally to numb the gums before engaging in dental practice? So there are a lot of different things that we can think about in terms of consumption. And that runs the gamut from the sort of everyday eating to stay alive sorts of things to the ritual practice that you get depicted in here, a mural from the Maya area. All right, so cleanup is also something that we want to think about because once the plants are mostly consumed or once they've been processed, there are peelings to get rid of, there's ash from the fire to sweep out, there's cleaning of dishes that have been dirtied. So there are a lot of different activities in the sort of theme of cleaning that we want to think about when we think about plant practices. So when we're trying to get evidence of all of these different kinds of practices, there are a couple of kinds of direct paleoethnobotanical evidence that we can make use of. So we've got phytoliths, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment, starch grains, which I'll be addressing in a moment as well, macrobotanical remains. All these are areas where I focus, so I'll get a little bit more detail on those. And then we've got the remains from pollen, things that make us sneeze in the spring. And those are pretty diagnostic, which is to say that we can use certain kinds of pollen grains to really pinpoint which plants that people were using at some point in time. There's DNA, where the DNA has preserved really well. We can make use of that. And then different kinds of chemical residues that include proteins, stable isotopes, lipids, and other sorts of markers. So you see here on the right, caffeine, which we associate with coffee. And then theobromine, and I'm not sure, let me see if I can see the little chat log here. Does anyone know what theobromine comes from? I see some typing. I'll wait for it. Or maybe I'm not able to see the comments. Oh, there we go. Although, you know what? I think there actually may be a little bit of a delay now that I'm looking at it on. Yes, thank you, Beth Haywood. It is chocolate, which I will be getting to toward the end of the lecture. So we've got all these different kinds of direct paleoethnobotanical evidence. And the three that I focus on, macro remains, phytoliths, and starch grains, I'll talk about a little bit more detail. So macro remains basically are any kind of carbonized remains that you can see with the naked eye. So you might not be able to identify it with the naked eye, but you could at least pick it out of a screen or see it in on a petri dish or something like that. It's something visible to the naked eye. This will include all sorts of things, tubers, seeds, fruits, other botanical parts. What I've got pictured here is a seed from tobacco. These are really, really, really tiny. They look like just little specks of dust in your hand, but under the microscope, they're very, very distinctive. They have, if you see on there, the sort of puzzle piece pattern on the exterior, what we call the testa of the seed. So very helpful for identification. Then we've got phytoliths, which are basically the silicified walls of cells, or sometimes the silica that gets deposited between plant cells from a variety of botanical parts, wood, fruit, seed, leaves, corn cobs, other botanical parts. So some of these are diagnostic, meaning they're different from all the other kinds of phytoliths out there. So we could pinpoint a particular species or genus or family of plants. Others are very sort of nondescript. So I have two images here. The one on the left, very nondescript kinds of phytoliths that you find in many, many, many different kinds of plants. But the ones on the right are what we would term diagnostic. And these are massive phytoliths that come from, still not visible to the naked eye, but massive phytoliths that come from the endocarps, the inner part of the fruit of the cocoyol palm. Very distinctive. They look like these kind of freaky planets under the microscope. And then in terms of microbotanical residues, we've also got starch grains, something else that I focus on. So these are crystalline food storage units that you recover from grains, from underground storage tissues like roots and tubers, sometimes from other kinds of seeds, and various other kinds of botanical parts. And as with phytoliths, sometimes they're diagnostic, they're really distinctive. Other times, virtually just non-diagnostic at all. They're either too small to identify, or you've got a particular kind of starch grain that looks the same across multiple types of plants. So some of them are really useful in our analysis, and some are less useful in the analysis. And the ones that I've got pictured here are starch grains from the sweet potato. So on the left, you see what it looks like normally under the microscope, and on the right, you see what happens when we give this kind of disco patina and we put it under polarized light. All right, so paleoethnobotanical data, most of the data that I work with come from either small sediment samples that I process to get rid of or to remove and study the phytoliths and starch grains, from what we call bulk flotation samples, big quantities of dirt where we float out the seeds, float out the charred and macrobotanical remains, and then residues and extracts that we get from ceramic and lithic artifacts of different kinds, or in some cases from human teeth or animal teeth, to see what people were eating, even in some cases their last meal. So I'm not going to go into great detail as to how these extractions take place, but there are a lot of methods involved to remove the pieces that we want. So it's almost like going through a secondary process of excavation. You might carry out excavations on a site and take some sediment samples, remove artifacts of different kinds and leave them unwashed. And then paleoethnobotanists basically do a sort of second set of excavations where we'll have to go through flotation and dig through the material under the microscope to see what's there and then identify it, tabulate it, and interpret it in different ways. So phytoliths require what I've got up top here, this process where you remove clays, you infuse it with a lot of very terrifying chemicals to get it to break down these different materials. You float them out using a heavy liquid, mount them on the microscope, and you can see here that looks like under the microscope, a kind of typical sediment sample. Starch grains, when we're removing them from artifacts, that's a little bit simpler. It basically entails kind of washing them in water, then washing them in what we call a sonicating bath. So if any of you have sonicating toothbrushes, it's a similar sort of procedure. It makes use of the property of cavitation, which basically means that as you're using the sonication, it agitates the water in such a way that little cavities form, and those cavities, like little bubbles in champagne, lift out the sort of impurities or the residues that we want to study that are on the artifacts. So your sonicating toothbrush is working basically the same way. We apply these same principles for extraction. So we mount those residues under a microscope, and on the right there you see a maize starch grain, a corn starch grain. That would be a pretty typical finding from artifacts in Mesoamerica. And at the bottom I've got the macrobotanical remains, and that's where we go through the process of collecting very large sediment samples. One site where I worked, we were collecting 40 liters, which is just about a wheelbarrow full, sending it through a flotation machine, floating out the little bits of seeds and things that float, plant remains that float, and then looking at those under the microscope, and you get a view of that to the right there as well. So a lot of different methods. Again, it's almost like excavating a second time. There are a lot of issues with paleoethnobotanical analysis. It's fairly time consuming. It can be fairly expensive, depending on what you need to do, how you need to process the material. Taking samples and begging our colleagues or fighting with our colleagues to get enough dirt or enough samples to say something meaningful can be tricky. It might not be surprising, but if you're working on a site and you're asking people to carry out with them just hundreds of liters of dirt per day, at the end of the day when you're tired and hot, there've been a lot of bugs, people are kind of resistant to collecting all this dirt for you and moving it out when they have to carry it sometimes long distances. There aren't a lot of paleoethnobotanists out there. It's definitely a more robust subdiscipline in Europe. In the Americas, we're still kind of gathering ourselves and kind of gaining critical mass. There are a lot of different issues in terms of the analysis itself. As I mentioned, sometimes you've got starch grains or phytoliths that are the same across different plants. So finding them doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be able to identify the plant associated with them. And then we've got preservation, always an issue with any kind of archaeological material. What sort of damage has taken place over time? How have things rotted or degraded? And to what extent can we still see what's going on based on the level of preservation? So a lot of different issues, but in spite of those issues, there are a lot of things that we can recover and interpret, a lot of different kinds of plant residues that we can work with in different ways. So just to give you a quick sense here of some of the recent work that's been done using paleoethnobotanical analysis, here are a couple examples from my dissertation work, actually. So one of the things that I recovered as I was working, all of these samples from the site in northwestern Honduras were these different, obviously, plant remains of different kinds, but we'd find them in a lot of different contexts. So you'd find some plant remains from in burials. You'd find some in trash heaps, which makes sense. You know, when people process things and they throw out the peelings, you might find them in a trash heap. But then there were some other things that were a little bit stranger. So from one of these sites in Honduras, from the site of Cerro Palenque, we found remains of the cocoyol palm. And here's a illustrator, Sarah Davidson's sort of depiction of what picking some of the fruits from the cocoyol palm might look like. We found some of these cocoyol palm remains next to ceramic kilns where people were producing ceramics and firing them, basically in these huge ovens. We're finding evidence of a bunch of these palm endocarps, the inside of the palm fruit. And so in trying to explain it, we thought, well, it might just be that, you know, as people are going through, they're enjoying the flavor of these things. And the cocoyol palm in particular is really interesting. Once you remove the sort of hard sort of coating, the exocarp, basically the palm fruit that's inedible. On the inside, you can see in that upper leftmost picture, Arnulfo is removing the exocarp, and inside is this kind of yellow fuzzyish material. Now, if you just remove the exocarp and you pop that whole thing in your mouth, it's got this really intense flavor. It's really buttery in a way, very fatty, and can be delicious if you like, you know, chewing on butter for fun. But then you move over, and on the inside is that durable endocarp. You can see that kind of hard nutshell looking thing that he's cracked open. And then to the far right, you can see the little palm kernel that he's pulled out. And that palm kernel tastes a lot like coconut. It's basically the hard palm endosperm. So what we were finding next to these ceramic kilns and in other places as well were these hard endocarps. And what are endocarps doing in, you know, next to these ceramic kilns? They weren't part of the firing process. There weren't other food remains nearby. So in thinking about this, one of the things that came out of the reference material, the reference sort of ethnographic material, was this idea that people might just have been snacking. So as they're working and carrying out their ceramic activities, kind of stoking the fire to get their ceramics to fire at proper levels, they were just perhaps sitting there snacking on these cocoyol palm fruits. So that was one sort of explanation that we could offer there. And this is from the site of Naranjal, Arnulfo and Kate and Don Ignacio enjoying. You can see just how big those things are. It looks like you've got the mumps or you've got a gobstopper in your mouth. But they are snacking on the job, what people 1,000, 2,000 years ago in ancient Honduras might have been up to as well. So another finding from my dissertation had to do with thinking about ethnohistoric models. So if we take the work of a friar from the northern Yucatan Peninsula, Fray Diego de Landa, who wrote a lot about daily life and ritual life in the northern Yucatan in the 1500s. That's a whole other story that I'll sort of set aside for the moment. But it's from Diego de Landa that a lot of archaeologists for many, many years, I would probably say about 100 years, got ideas for how people were cultivating food, processing food, the different kinds of foods that people were making use of, the different kinds of plants that people were making use of. So for many years, the models on agriculture in Mesoamerica and the models of what people were eating in terms of plants were all based on this idea of slash and burn agriculture, that people, according to Diego de Landa and the archaeologists who drew from his work, people were practicing slash and burn agriculture for about 2,000 years, and that they were primarily cultivating maize, beans, and squash, corn, beans, and squash. You hear about the sort of trinity of foods in different areas of the world, not just Mesoamerica. But what was found at the site of Hoya de Siren, a site that was covered by volcanic ash and preserved really well, a site in central El Salvador, was that there was a lot of manioc cultivation going on. So on the one hand, we've got this ethnohistoric model that comes from about 1566. And then on the other hand, we've got some modern archaeological work at a site that has impeccable preservation, just really well-sealed contexts. And you can see in this image here, all of the sort of green indicates the maize or corn cultivation area. All of that light sort of beige indicates manioc or cassava cultivation areas. And then that pink part represents areas that were likely to have been uncultivated or might have been fallowing at the time that the volcano erupted. So what we find at this site is, if we think about Delanda's model, he said their principal sustenance is maize. They're practicing slash and burn agriculture. That's how they got the maize. Slash and burn agriculture doesn't work out so well for the environment in the long run. It results in a lot of soil erosion and sometimes even local climate change, which would have then made it more inhospitable to grow more maize. So you might have over time had some real agricultural difficulties if you were carrying out slash and burn agriculture through multiple cycles. So that's the model that we would get from the historic records. But if we look at some of the archaeological records from the site of El Seren, then we see something very different. We see a lot of manioc being planted. And the project director, Payson Sheets, that I show here holding up a manioc tuber in a really menacing way. As he put it, manioc was planted with greater care in the classic period than at present. So versus this model that we've got set up by Diego de Landa, who said slash and burn agriculture, lots of maize, we've got this other model from Payson Sheets and the work in El Salvador that says there was a lot more manioc being planted. There were a lot more root and tubers being planted. It wasn't just maize, and it wasn't just slash and burn agriculture. And you can see below the image of Payson Sheets with the cassava, with the manioc, some images of some of the things that they recovered from Hoya de Seren. There's an image of some charred beans on a little pedestal. And then the other three images are all plaster casts. So similarly to what they did at the site of Pompeii in Italy, they were able to, as they were excavating, find these little sort of holes in the excavation units. They filled them with dental plaster and then excavated around them. So eventually what you're left with is, for example, maize still growing on a stalk, this little bit of an agave plant kind of sticking out from the ground, and at the very bottom, lots and lots and lots of manioc that had been planted, which is how they were able to determine these sort of plots of cultivation. So these are the two sort of models we've got for what might have been going on during the classic period or the formative period in Mesoamerica, in northwestern Honduras. What I found in my research was that there was we had a lot more evidence for the model as we see with Payson Sheets' work at Hoya de Seren. We see an extensive use of root and tuber crops versus maize as a sort of exclusive staple crop, and a wide spectra of procurement production strategies. So people weren't just cultivating using slash and burn agriculture. We're not just cultivating corn. We're cultivating a wide variety of materials. And I got most of this information from taking extractions from some obsidian blade fragments at these sites. So here's Sarah Davidson, illustrator's representation of how people might have been using these incredibly sharp obsidian prismatic blades to slice into different kinds of roots and tubers. To the very left, we've got a root crop that's more common in northern South America called liren or leren, or calathea. In the middle, we've got someone slicing into a sweet potato, and to the right, we've got someone slicing into manioc or cassava. So on the very bottom, you can see the images of the starch grains that I recovered that correspond to each one of these plants. But I found starch grains from achira and arrowroot as well. So a lot of different kinds of plants that people were using in addition to maize. It wasn't this sort of strong focus on maize agriculture for survival, which runs counter to those earlier sort of historic models. So to move on, what is paleoethnobotany telling us about chocolate, Theobroma cacao? There's a lot that we can talk about in terms of the use of chocolate in ancient Mesoamerica. There have been a lot of studies done, anthropological, nutritional studies, historical, economic studies, agricultural studies, and of course, archaeological studies, among many others. Lots of ways that people have approached it. So modern cultivation of cacao takes place in not so very many regions as you would expect, at least in Mesoamerica. So we've got people taking advantage of what are called these sort of microclimates in different parts of the northern Yucatan Peninsula. So you might have these sort of natural sinkholes in the limestone shelf of the Yucatan Peninsula. And in the kind of dense jungle foliage, as you see in the sort of upper left image, they'll plant cacao as well. It'll do really well in these microenvironments, in these basic sinkholes where there's a little bit more moisture and it's a little bit more cooler. It's a little bit cooler than it is kind of at ground level. Then we've got farms in Tabasco and Mexico, Chiapas, lots of different locations throughout Mesoamerica. Cacao tends to grow pretty well there when it's got the right conditions for growth. So modern cultivation is taking place in a number of places. So where was ancient cultivation taking place, or what evidence do we have for the movement or the use of chocolate? And what even is potentially recoverable when we're thinking about chocolate or the cacao plant and different kinds of products it produces? So different processing techniques we can think about, and the ways that people process cacao is usually dictated by, on the one hand, the level of acidity in the crop, usually related to soil conditions of different kinds, as well as the end product. So there are three sorts of general methods that people pursue in modern times. There'll be the fermentation of the seeds that can take 3 to 8 days. And this is why you can go to the store and get cacao nibs or cacao beans and, obviously cacao powder, cocoa powder, but you're rarely, if ever, going to find the fruits themselves. That's because the fruits are used in the production. Oftentimes the seeds are mashed up into the fruits themselves and left to rot, or not rot, that's a strong word, left to ferment for several days. And that's why you get all of these interesting flavors in chocolate. You can have a little bite of a high-end chocolate or even a not very high-end chocolate, and people will describe different flavors like, oh, I taste vanilla, I taste banana, I taste prune, a lot of different sort of flavor profiles, similar to wine. And like wine, that has to do with the fermentation process. So if the cacao beans undergo this process where they're fermented in the fruit itself, this is considered by a lot of people to produce the product of the highest quality. Again, you've got all of these sort of flavors that will emerge from the cacao, but it's more time consuming and a little bit more expensive to produce. Other people will wash the cacao beans and then perhaps ferment them lightly, not necessarily in the fruit. And this is described as sweated chocolate or sweated cacao. And this is a technique that's fairly common, it's fairly rapid, it doesn't require special preparation of the fruit, and what emerges from that is a fairly common sort of bitter chocolate. And then there are the cacao beans that are not fermented at all and are not washed at all, and this produces basically the cheapest sort of chocolate. It's fairly bitter, not especially tasty, is often what companies like Hershey's are using and cutting with other kinds of chocolate. So different sorts of processing techniques used in the present that we think about having maybe been used in the past. So where and how are we recovering chocolate archaeologically? How can we get at these things? You've seen this image here, the actual cacao beans. These do not appear to have been fermented at all. A cacao pod, this one is very old and dry. It's not one you would want to consume in any way, and a grinding stone that was perhaps used to grind up the cacao beans after fermentation and roasting. So what have paleoethnobotanists tried to look at to get at cacao in ancient sites? First of all, they're the seeds, and when we carry out experiments where we char them experimentally to sort of simulate the roasting process, we see that there are a lot of external anatomical features that are retained, but the seeds end up being really prone to fracture and dispersal. So you might be finding a lot of little pieces of cacao in the archaeological record, but it's hard to identify them. They're so sort of broken up and dispersed that it's difficult to identify. The wood is very distinctive. It's very diagnostic. So in a few archaeological sites, we've got some good examples of people making use of wood to identify cacao in the past. The pollen as well, the pollen grains are very, very distinctive, easy to identify, related, in relation to other sorts of pollen. The phytoliths, unfortunately, none found to date. I and other researchers have done a lot of experimental work to see if there's any kind of phytolith that might be recoverable from some portion of the plant. It seems like these structures called crystal rhaphides are present in uncharred seeds, but those do not preserve very well, unfortunately. And starch grains, cacao kernels, the seeds of the cacao, produce some starch grains. They produce a lot of starch grains, but unfortunately they're really, really tiny, non-diagnostic. So they look like the starch grains that perhaps 50 other plants would produce, identical to these. So not helpful for the paleoethnobotanist. But helpfully, cacao produces a very diagnostic chemical signature, especially in Mesoamerica. It is the only plant that produces theobromine. So when we find the chemical signature of theobromine, again, strongly or very closely related, should I say, to caffeine, it's a pretty solid indicator that people were making use of that vessel or that tool or that location for processing or consuming cacao in some way. So we might find these chemical signatures. We also get iconographic representations of people working with cacao or preparing cacao. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. There's a lot of discussion in European contact period documents about cacao, its uses. And then you get moments where you can see at the top of the pot here, I'm trying to think how I would describe that glyph. It looks like a sort of feather next to a little almost monkey face with almost a sort of hockey stick and hockey puck underneath it. So many epigraphers are rolling in their graves right now. Yes, thank you. That glyph right there. Oh man, that was the worst epigraphic description ever. Anyway, so you've got that glyph, which represents cacao. It's actually the sort of phonetic pronunciation of cacao. It's like cacao. Represented by that sort of set of glyphs. And this we see marked onto different vessels or on murals sometimes, providing a pretty good indicator that cacao is in some way related. In this case, this vessel was described as belonging to a particular ruler. So it was a sort of cacao vessel of this ruler. And this is from the site of Rio Azul in Guatemala, a Maya site. So we've also got the occasional archaeological find of a bit of a seed or a portion of the fruit, or a little bit of cacao wood. But in the modern era, we are most often finding evidence of cacao through epigraphic or sort of written texts addressing cacao or through these chemical residues. And what's really interesting is that these cacao residues, they're showing up not only in Mesoamerica, where cacao is frequently used and processed, consumed, traded, but also as far north as Chaco Canyon, the site of Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico. Cacao does not grow anywhere within about 1,000 miles of Chaco Canyon. So in finding these residues at Chaco Canyon, we should call it Chocolate Canyon, there's really only one way that it could have gotten there, and that's through some kind of very long distance trade. Again, at least 1,000 miles before you find cacao growing anywhere to the south. So that, along with other evidence, gives us a pretty good idea of trade routes and perhaps even, to a certain degree, political organization in the deep past between Mesoamerica and more sort of northern groups. So in terms of the archaeological evidence, we're finding all sorts of things. On the right here, I've got an example of some cacao seeds that were recovered from the site of Hoya de Siren, that site that had been covered with volcanic ash and preserved really well. On the left, we've got these little cacao beans, or they're not actual cacao beans, but they're little artifacts made to look like cacao beans out of shell. So this was something that in some cases may have been used in ritualized contexts. People might have presented this as a sort of offering, in a burial or in some sort of ritualized cache. But we've also got evidence of people crafting fake cacao beans for counterfeiting purposes. So this is something that was described historically a couple of times from Bernardino and Sahagún's Florentine Codex. We've got this great discussion of how in the marketplaces in the Aztec Empire, the bad cacao seller counterfeits cacao. He takes amaranth seed dough, wax, avocado pits, and he counterfeits these little cacao seeds. And then he covers this over with cacao bean holes. So he takes the holes from the cacao and kind of stuffs this fake cacao in there. And this whitish sort of fresh cacao, or rather the whitish or fresh cacao beans that haven't been fermented, that haven't been sort of roasted and prepared, he intermixes with these. So we've got all this sort of counterfeiting of cacao beans, and throwing in of wild cacao beans that don't taste very good. So these are all ways of kind of bulking up the cacao stores. So we've got Sahagún sort of complaining about this in the marketplace. Some of these Aztec vendors are going about it the wrong way. We've also got Hernán Cortés describing in his sort of chronicles when he was battling the Aztecs, the chocolate consumption that he witnessed in the court of Emperor Moctezuma. And as he described it, the emperor took no other beverage than chocolate, which is the sort of nominal way of saying chocolate, a potation of chocolate that was flavored with vanilla and other spices, and so prepared as to be reduced to a froth of the consistency of honey, which gradually dissolved in the mouth and was taken cold. So this beverage, if so it could be called, was served in golden goblets with spoons of the same metal or of tortoiseshell finely wrought. So this wasn't just a kind of quick drinking of a hot chocolate. Well, it wasn't even hot to begin with. This was a very kind of ceremonialized activity. It was a very special moment. So as much as we might consider coffee to be kind of our sort of sacred beverage that keeps us going, in this case it's even more sacred. It's even more special. We've got Hernan Cortez describing the emperor taking it in a really particular way from a golden goblet. So we can get this sense of the importance of cacao. On the one hand, you have emperors drinking it in these very ceremonialized contexts. On the other hand, you have people trying to counterfeit it, like money, effectively. And as it turns out, cacao was used as currency in some cases. So you might be able to take cacao beans and go down to the marketplace and trade them for different kinds of materials. So it didn't work in the same way as most currencies operate today, but it was a good sort of in-between unit. So if you went down to the marketplace and you had, say, 10 turkeys to trade and you needed to get some different household goods, maybe some obsidian blades, maybe some baskets or some mats and things, if you went to the marketplace, you might first go through the sort of intermediary sale where you would get a bunch of cacao beans in exchange for the turkeys that you brought for sale. Then you could take those cacao beans and use them to pay other vendors in the marketplace. So it worked as this sort of expedient, or not even expedient currency, but it's a sort of in-between exchange item that people could use, which is why we've got so much evidence of people trying to counterfeit them. And this complaint by Bernardino Sahagún about people trying to counterfeit these beans to sell them off in different ways. It was basically like counterfeiting money. We've also got iconographic evidence that shows up in different places. This is the lid of a ceremonial vessel that was recovered at the site of Copan, a Maya site in Honduras. And you can see on this, sort of monkey lid, he's sticking out his little tongue. There's a cacao leaf kind of tucked behind his right ear. And then we've got a couple of cacao pods sort of sticking out of this necklace that the monkey has got. Yes, thank you. Whoever's operating that pointer, I appreciate it. So we've got lots of iconographic evidence, whether we've got representations of little cacao beans carved into shell, or we've got depictions of cacao beans showing up on murals, or cacao pods showing up on murals, showing up on ceramics, showing up in these different locations. And then we've got a few examples where we have the preparation of cacao represented. So this is a figure from what's called the Princeton vase. It's a late classic Maya vase that's showing what is likely to be the preparation of some kind of foamed cacao beverage. So if you recall that description that Cortez had put forward in the Emperor Moctezuma's court about the frothing, the elaborate frothing of the chocolate, this is likely how it took place. This careful pouring from one vessel to another, and then picking up that vessel, pouring it back in the original vessel. So there's a sort of frothing back and forth to really get the sort of foam of the chocolate, to sort of aerate the chocolate and bring out its flavor. So this is something that we see in kind of formal court scenes as they're depicted on ceramic vases, and I think in one case in a mural. So in this case, we've got some people hanging out in court. There are a few rulers there, and we've got someone preparing the chocolate drink by pouring it from vessel to vessel. And the thing to bear in mind, this chocolate drink would have been very different. For starters, it would have been cold, so somewhat similar to the maybe chocolate milk you can pick up at a 7-Eleven. But it was not sweetened, or very rarely sweetened with honey, and it would have been very spicy. People would have been adding a little bit of salt and a lot of chili pepper in some cases to the chocolate to flavor it, and vanilla as well. So it would have been this sort of spicy, vanilla-y, not very sweet, cold, frothy beverage made without milk, because there would have been no dairy at this time period. So a very different flavor from how we think of enjoying chocolate today. And then, of course, we've got lots of these sort of codex depictions. And so what you see on the bottom here is a a representation of a cacao plant. We see these depicted in a lot of different cases, sometimes in association with different kinds of ritual activities or calendrical sort of important dates of different kinds, and sometimes just represented as related to growing and cultivation practices. So then we could also talk about the colonialization of chocolate. So I'm drawing this description here from Antonio Lavedan, who talked about in English the sort of uses, abuses, properties, and virtues of tobacco, coffee, tea, and chocolate. This was something that was written in 1796 and then reproduced in 1991. So you've got this description where he says, when the Spanish and the Portuguese arrived in the Americas, the inhabitants there made a cacao liqueur which was diluted in hot water, seasoned with pepper and other spices, and all these ingredients gave this mixture a brutish quality, as he puts it, and a very savage taste. The Spanish, more industrious than the savages, as he puts it, procured to correct the bad flavor of this liquor. They added to this cacao paste different fragrances of the East and many spices of Spain. Of all these ingredients, we've maintained only the sugar, vanilla, and cinnamon. So the idea here is that the cacao, as these savages in the Americas were producing it, was not quite good enough for civilized palates. So they had to colonize it in very specific ways and make it palatable to the rest of the world, thus removing the sort of brutish or savage nature of the chocolate. So this is language that we see during the colonial period and kind of post-colonial period, though not post-colonial, in different sorts of documents related not just to cacao, but to how people practiced religious activities of different kinds, how people dressed, what they wore, how they adorned themselves, their daily activities, how they cultivated their food. So this is a really nice snapshot in terms of chocolate of how some of these later European writers were considering Mesoamerican peoples from the pre-contact period, or the people that they were actively trying to missionize and colonize in these different ways. So if we remove chocolate and put in basically Mesoamerican people, it almost works equivalently when we talk about colonization. All right, and then of course we've got chocolate in recent history. There has been a lot of documentation, especially around central Mexico, of different kinds of special preparations of chocolate. So we see chocolate beginning to move its way across the world, a plant that was domesticated in Mesoamerica, made use of for a few thousand years, then picked up by the Spaniards, exported, colonized to make it palatable to European tastes. We see it making its way across the world, and we also see transformations of traditions within Mexico and other countries in Mesoamerica. So here we've got a depiction of a woman producing cacao, likely as it would have been done for many, many hundreds of years. So very traditional practice being upheld, where she's roasting the beans, as you see on the left, using some kind of comal and ceramic dish, and then taking those roasted beans and grinding them down using one of these handheld manos and metates to make the fine paste that would then get frothed into a hot chocolate beverage. At this point in history, people were making a lot of use of milk, dairy products, both goat milk and cow milk, and adding a lot of sweeteners. So the flavor of chocolate was really transformed during the colonial period and afterwards into the flavor that's the more common one that we think of today. So in terms of recent work, there have been some interesting sorts of approaches that have to do with ritual, religion, and chocolate on the one hand. So this is another vessel from the site of Copan, the Maya site of Copan. This is an enormous stone incensario or incense burner. This was recovered from near one of the temples at Copan, one of the major sort of temples from the classic period. So we see in this one, versus a sort of bat-faced ceramic lid I showed you earlier, we see the face of a bat. And so you see the sort of bat-like nose and the large kind of glaring bat eye. He's got his little mouth open. Thank you, person with the pointer. And at the base of this bat, we see loads of cacao pods just kind of peppering the body of the vessel, the body of the bat. So this incense burner would have been used to burn probably incense from the copal tree. I showed you that image of a gentleman removing little bits of the resin from the copal trunk. making a really fragrant, really smoky incense that would have been used in ritualized contexts. Given the cacao pods that are showing up on this vessel, it's very likely that cacao factored into these sort of ritual practices as well. We might have had people feasting and consuming chocolate. We might have had people consuming chocolate and, say, balche, or the fermented bark from the balche tree. Might have been a lot of different activities going on, but what's very clear is that given this enormous, elaborately carved stone vessel plunked down right next to a large temple, is that cacao had some sort of special importance as well, and they wouldn't likely be putting it on their big bat incensario otherwise. We can also talk about the spouted vessels that show up at a lot of Mesoamerican sites. And I showed you guys an image of, on the one hand, a woman pouring from one cylindrical vessel to another, sort of from one vase to another, the cacao to froth it up. Well, it seems as though some of these spouted vessels, these vessels that have these little pouring spouts, might have served the same purpose and might have sort of frothed it up a little bit more quickly or given a little bit more control over the frothing process. So these are materials that have shown up from the formative period up well into the classic period. And they've been found in a lot of different burial contexts. So I showed you guys the one vessel from Rio Azul that had the glyph of cacao on it. It also had residues of cacao on the insides. Well, from other burial contexts elsewhere in Mesoamerica, we're finding similar vessels. And even though they don't have the glyph for cacao on them, even though they're not the same sort of cylindric or special sort of handled vessel, we're finding lots of these theobromine residues inside of them, that nice diagnostic marker for cacao. So this is what one of them looks like in color. This one is made to look something like a gourd. Probably some of the first vessels in Mesoamerica were different kinds of gourd and squash vessels, so this is made to sort of mimic those. And you see the little spout on it, again, likely used for frothing chocolate. And this would be, again, one of the vessels where theobromine residues were recovered. And so we're finding these in lots of different burial contexts. You guys can see here, we've got a little spouted vessel. There's also, if you look just below that spouted vessel, something that looks like a little colander with a long handle. And this might have been used for burning incense. It also might have been used for toasting cacao. And I don't think anyone has done the study so far where they're taking extractions from these sort of, what do they call them, skillet incensarios or panhandled incensarios, and subjecting them to kind of residue testing. It'll be very interesting to see if we've got this kind of variety of uses for them, incense as well as cacao toasting. But what we do know is we've got, and this is from the site of Monte Albán, the Zapotec area in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico. We've got one of these spouted vessels. So they're not just in the Maya area, they're moving around. They're in lots of different locations on the landscape. And so we're finding cacao residues, again, as far north as Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico. And then we're finding these really particular vessels used for frothing cacao or serving cacao in a wide variety of locations in Mesoamerica proper, especially in burial contexts. And this just shows you some of the distribution of those. So in the Maya area, the distribution, we've got them at Colha, we've got them at Ceibal, Tikal, lots and lots and lots of spots, and also including the area where I carried out my dissertation work, which is just outside of the Maya area, northwestern Honduras. So Puerto Escondido, Naranjal or Los Naranjos, Playa de los Muertos. These are all locations where some of these spouted vessels have been recovered. So to sum up, we see how cacao is an important plant to ancient, historic, and of course to modern people. I'm sure most people at this point have tasted cacao if they're not eating it regularly. So we see how it's made its way across the landscape, how it's been processed in a variety of ways, and how people have incorporated into sort of ritual contexts of different kinds, whether it's a ceremony or a burial, or even, as we've got more modern times, just a sort of daily consumption. So I'll stop there, everyone. Thank you for your time. And I guess we've got, what is it, about 20 minutes for questions? Is that right?
Thank you so much. We actually have about 6 minutes for question. It's scheduled until 1, but we can go over it.
Oh, okay.
And thank you so much. This was so interesting. And I'm just going to start from the bottom here. In terms of questions, we got quite a few questions here in the chat. So Tracy is asking about how terms such as chocolate are used in descriptions of indigenous people by Europeans and other Westerners in general. Is that something you have thought about?
I'm sorry, could you say the first part of the question again?
So how does this relate to the ways in which the term chocolate is used to describe indigenous people?
That's a good question. That's something that is seemingly more modern in nature, and it's that's well outside my area of expertise. I'm not a historian, and I'm not a sociocultural anthropologist, so it's something I would be able to speak to less. But it certainly seems like a good thing to consider, especially when we see this history of chocolate and how it was civilized. So relating it to, the sort of indigenous experience in the Americas and how people became civilized, I think there's a strong analogy there. To what extent they're very closely related in terms of modern sort of use of chocolate as an adjective to describe people, I'd be more hesitant to talk about that, not my area of expertise. But in the sort of histories of people and the histories of chocolate, we see a lot of parallels in this kind of theme of colonization.
I apologize for dog barks. Next question, have you done any work with frankincense?
So not frankincense per se. Frankincense is the more kind of common conception of it. Frankincense is an old world sort of incense. So there has been some good work done on incenses of different kinds from the old world, frankincense being one of them. That's not a region of the world that I've worked in terms of paleoethnobotany, so I'm less familiar with that sort of perspective. But in terms of the incense that we find in Mesoamerica, there was a wide variety of plants that people were making use of to, tap the resins, turn the resins into incense of different kinds, and burn it in lots of different kinds of ceremonial contexts. And healing contexts as well. There are different kinds of healing smoke that people would use. So even the term copal, it might come from the tree Proteum copal. It might come from other trees in that same family, the Burseraceae family. So I've done a lot of more ethnographic work on trees in that family, trying to understand how people might have made use of these different kinds of incense. But the residue studies are a little bit lagging. The chemical residue studies would be the direction we'd likely have to go. There have been some nice wood studies done to see some of these kinds of trees, where they're showing up in Mesoamerica, but we don't have good direct evidence of chemical residues in different kinds of incense burning vessels outside of the site of the Cenote Azul, the major cenote or major sort of lake sinkhole at the site of Chichen Itza. People were depositing or throwing in these offerings of different kinds, and in some vessels we've got whole sort of balls of incense that have kind of been stuck into the ceramic vessel prior to burning, and then just kind of tossed into the sacred cenote, tossed in the sort of sacred lake as part of a, again, some sort of a ritualized practice.
Excellent. So I have a couple of questions here about chocolate specifically. Tracy is asking if you have any idea how similar that chocolate drink is to traditional Mexican treats today.
How similar it is to traditional Mexican drinks today?
Yeah, so what you call traditional
or
today.
treats, sorry.
If
treats. Okay, I see it there. So the addition of sugarcane was not in the Americas. People were using honey as sweetener, and sometimes fruits and sort of fruit gums, or how should I put this, like fruit syrups of different kinds to add sweetener to things. So sugar would not have been around. Other sweeteners might have been used. The sort of hard chocolate bar, there wasn't a use of chocolate involved it as consuming it as a sort of candy. It may have been consumed frequently for the fruit, and the guess is it was originally domesticated because people were fermenting the fruit to produce some sort of alcoholic beverage, and then started making use of the seeds as well. And then eventually the seeds turned into the part that people really wanted to produce and consume, and the fruit just kind of ended up being a sort of byproduct of that process. So in terms of chocolate bars, those kinds of chocolate treats, we would not have found those in antiquity. And again, the big difference would have been in the general lack of sweetener for chocolate, the general use as a beverage versus a solid food, and the addition of spicy chiles as well to give it different kinds of flavors. So all these things are fairly different from how it's consumed today. Although the use of chili in chocolate is kind of coming back into vogue. You can go to some restaurants now and get chili brownies and things like that. So that's shifting, but yeah, 20 years ago it would have been very rare. Those would have been very different sort of chocolate traditions.
I was also wondering how, so you talked about how chocolate was used as almost a currency, as an intermediate in trading. How expensive was cacao at that time, kind of relatively? And what part of the population had access to consuming it? So we talked about consuming at the courts and in rituals, but to what degree did peasants, other people, have access to actually consuming cacao?
It's a great question and an ongoing question, because in an economy where your money literally grows on trees, the question is, how many people were growing it, who had access to it, and even the people that were able to grow cacao, to what extent did they have control over that production? It seems to be fairly variable. So in parts of Honduras, there was a lot of cacao production, and it seems as though there were people who would produce, and they would consume some of it at home. So these were more just kind of your everyday farmers, kind of middle-class farmers. They'd produce it, they'd consume it at home, and then they'd send a lot of it off in trade canoes to move into other parts of the Maya area and further north. As you go further north, it becomes more and more difficult to grow, to cultivate cacao. So that's where the real sort of question marks come in. To what extent were people, if they had cacao trees, able to control the production of it? And we can use as something of an analog the description of cacao farmers in Western Africa today. There was a piece that came out, oh goodness, maybe about a year ago, this documentary that came out, where there were all of these farmers in Western Africa helping to cultivate cacao, harvesting the cacao, processing it to a certain degree, but very few of them had tasted chocolate. It was something that just was not within the cultural tradition on the one hand, but was so exceedingly expensive considering their sort of subsistence wages that it would just not have factored into their life in any way. So part of the documentary, there's a gentleman who comes and he's got this stash of chocolate bars, and he starts handing them around and seeing what people think. And it's interesting because, the idea of this kind of savior coming in with this chocolate is kind of upset by the fact that some of these farmers taste it and are like, this is terrible, I don't want to eat any more of this. So we've got these different sort of scenarios. And so if we think of that as a potential analogy for the past, it might have been that there were a lot of people producing cacao, plucking it from the trees, but might have been either very heavily taxed, so that all of the production went towards some, elite overlord somewhere or some elite sort of political structure elsewhere. Or it might have been that the trees themselves would have been owned by other people. And so, you'd have these farmers who were basically hired as laborers, but didn't actually own the trees, didn't own the land, and so were only kind of involved in this production. So it's all that's to say, it's still a big question mark, and the access that people had would depend on where it was grown and what kind of elite overburden there would have been. And so when you've got the Spaniards coming into this area and starting to colonize the peninsula, starting to colonize the Yucatan Peninsula, they see this great sort of production scheme going on. They think chocolate's pretty cool. It's something that's exportable. It's a good sort of commodity that they can make use of. So what they tended to do in a lot of places was nick the elite person off the top of the sort of cacao food chain, install their own people, and keep the chocolate coming. So then they could make all the money, they could profit by it in these different ways. So what we see historically, we see cacao moving around in the landscape, it's getting traded. In some cases, even the more kind of commoner folk would have had access to it. The very poorest people would have had access to it, would have been able to consume it if they were near a growing location or a big center of trade. But in other cases, it would have been pretty inaccessible. Like the further north you get, like especially as you get up into central Mexico, where the Aztecs are, where Emperor Moctezuma is, cacao would have been really rarely consumed by your sort of average Joe. Even the people going to the marketplace handling cacao regularly were probably not consuming it regularly. But yeah, big question mark.
Great. I have one more question here. Do we have evidence of what is the oldest evidence of cacao? Do we know that? Do you have a date of how far back?
Yes, so the oldest, what's tricky is the cacao plant itself seems to have come from South America, probably from the Amazon. Curiously, though, the plant itself was moved north and then chocolate was domesticated. So we don't have domesticated versions of cacao showing up in these earliest time periods in South America, in the Amazon basin. We do have domesticated cacao showing up in Mesoamerica. So its sort of point of origin and its point of domestication are very different. That being said, the earliest evidence we've got for cacao in Mesoamerica right now probably comes from northwestern Honduras and dates to about 800 BCE.
Okay.
So about 2,800 years ago.
Yeah.
And the idea is with these earliest vessels is that, again, people were either consuming or producing fermented cacao fruit beverages. They weren't messing with the beans. The same theobromine chemical signature showed up in these vessels. They were able to say, okay, we've got these chunks of these vessels, these ceramic sherds showing up. When we test them for the residues, theobromine is showing up. The idea is, in this case, it's the fermented fruit that people are consuming. So cacao, perhaps originally domesticated for the fruit, later comes to be used mostly for the beans and almost exclusively for the beans.
Great. Do we have any more questions for Shanti before we let her go?
I'm seeing a lot of recipes here. I'm seeing chocolate and vodka. I'm seeing cacao and bourbon.
Let's get more combinations of chocolate and alcohol. Sounds also like it's connected even in its origin with the fermentation, and then the chocolate came out of it.
No, it's true.
Still the last popsicle. Chocolate and coffee, yeah.
Yes, also a fantastic combination.
That said, I have a small piece of dark chocolate most nights. Of course, it is incredibly tasty, but it's also very healthy.
Yes, allegedly high in antioxidants, and the theobromine gives you that little kick similarly to caffeine. So
very tasty. Chocolate goes with everything. I agree that. Of course, I have to say that I lived in Belgium, in Brussels, for some years. And of course, you have a chocolate shop at most corners.
That sounds like a fantastic idea.
Very famous for the chocolate. They have chocolate shops with these small pralines of filled chocolate. Of course, you can also get just a bar of pure chocolate, but they have all these small pralines, so you can go in and buy 2 filled chocolates, and they are, as I said, on every other corner. I mean, they're everywhere. It's
that sounds pretty fantastic to me. And it's interesting, as with so many of the great commodities of the world, and certainly as with coffee, you go to some of these cacao producing regions in Mesoamerica, and the chocolate that's available, similarly to the coffee that's available, is not good. The good stuff all goes to export.
Oh, yeah.
And it has to do with, many kind of inequitable sort of economic relationships that have been established there. But yeah, so if you go, a lot of the times, similarly to that complaint about counterfeit cacao beans, you go and there are a lot of chocolates that contain a lot of wax. Or you go and you have coffee that's kind of like the dregs of the production, because it's it's so expensive to kind of or not expensive per se, but either people don't have access to the cultivation, they can't cultivate it for themselves, the cultivation has been taken over by larger companies, or it's just they get so much more economic advantage from exporting the good stuff, even in families where they're producing their own coffee, that it's rare that they would retain enough coffee for themselves. And certainly they wouldn't sell it in a local marketplace because they get so much more money trying to sell it elsewhere in the world, where people are paying the top dollar for the really high quality beans. So you get these really curious economic relationships that result in, coffee and chocolate, things grown in these regions, becoming very expensive, even for your kind of average quality within the
Another
regions
crop
themselves.
where I think that is happening is quinoa.
Yes, that is
Because since we
absolutely
have in the
true.
West started consuming it, and I'm guilty, I really like it, so I do use it, I cook with it. But that the local that use that as a staple in their diet, and it was cheap, that they have less and less access to it, precisely because of those factors. It's being exported, and it's becoming expensive to keep it there.
No, it's true. And everything that gets marketed in terms of a sort of ancient grain or a superfood, or there are a lot of labels that get applied. And yeah, it can end up being very expensive for people to maintain the consumption of those products in the sort of point of origin. So yeah, it's a sort of problematic aspect of living in a globalized world, definitely.
Tracy had one question about the butternut, if anyone had tried to market that.
So it's interesting. Just yesterday, I was reading an article about that, and the article was related more to the production of different kinds of oils from the cocoa palm, than it was the kind of production of the palm fruits to sell elsewhere. I don't think they preserve really well, so it's not. It wouldn't be a situation where you could pick a bunch of these palm fruits and then kind of ship them for a week or 2 weeks to, other points in the world to be consumed. I think they have a very short shelf life. That being said, they are, to pick them, the plants themselves have all of these spines, these really wicked long spines. And so to harvest the fruit is a pretty unpleasant process, very slow going. So I think between those two factors, in a lot of ways, it'd be a more environmentally sound endeavor than, say, the production of palm oil as we've got it now from the royal palm, other kinds of palm trees. But it would also be fairly expensive ultimately, versus these other kind of palm oils that get produced. So if you live in a climate that would support the cocoa palm, it'd be really neat to grow it in your backyard. But yeah, outside of that, I think sending the whole fruits abroad it doesn't work so well for preservation reasons, and processing them and selling the oil ends up being a little bit more expensive. But these are things that could change. It's very high in some great fatty acids, so there may be people who down the road make use of that in some way or another.
Great. Shanti, Dr. Morelhart, I want to say thank you so much for this exciting presentation. It was very interesting.
Kathy, well, thank you guys so much for having me, and thank you, listeners, for listening.
Thanks,
Shanti. Thank you, everyone who attended. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Bye. Bye.